Welcome dear friends to yet another lecture on the Critical Studies 2 paper prescribed for MA students of Kerala University. Now today we shall attempt a discussion of the essay by Jurgen Habermas. Now, Modernity and Incomplete Project is an essay that is prescribed for our required study, Modernity and Incomplete Project. Now this essay is by the author Jurgen Habermas. Now Jurgen Habermas was born in Germany in 1929 and is one of the most influential philosophers of the world. He grew in post-war Germany and was aware of the depth of the moral and political failure of Germany under National Socialism. Now, he has the intellectual background of the Frankfurt School of Social Thought. So, Habermas. Now, Habermas was a social theorist in the tradition of critical theory and pragmatism. He is best known for his theories on communicative, rationality and the public sphere. Habermas was a strong defender of modernity, and the assaults made by postmodernists on modernists are strongly countered by Habermas. Now, modernity is a child of enlightenment and is anchored in reason and democracy. So, modernity is anchored on reason and democracy. Now, modernism is an unfinished project, he would say. Much more has to be done in the realm of modernity before thinking of the possibility of a postmodern world. While the world has lost faith in the enlightenment project promoted by reason, Habermas remains as one of the strongest defenders of modernity. On the eve of getting a prize bearing the name of Theodor Adorno in 1980, Jurgen Habermas delivered a lecture, and this essay is the outcome of that lecture. The essay, Modernity and Incomplete Project, highlights how modernity as a project fails. He has taken many aspects like aesthetic modernity, cultural and social modernization, societal modernization, the project enlightenment and negating culture, to present them in different sections of the essay. Habermas begins his defense of modernity with the definition of concepts, the ancient and the modern. The concepts of the ancient and the modern. The word modern is derived from the Latin word modernus, and it indicates a transition from old to the new. So, modern means a transition from old to the new. Restricting modernity to the Renaissance is too narrow, according to Habermas. The term modern was used in history whenever something new was formed in relation to the ancient. Something new was formed in relation to the ancient. Thus, antiquity, the ancient, was considered as a model to be recovered through imitation. But this idea of looking back to the ancient was discarded, and a new form of modernist consciousness was formed. The romantic modernists, they rejected the antique ideals of the classicists and found newness in the ideals of the Middle Ages. But the ideals prescribed by the romantic modernists did not remain fixed. These emerged a radicalized consciousness of modernity that freed itself from all historical ties. Thus, our modernity or the recent modernity makes an abstract opposition between tradition and the present. Therefore, the distinguished mark of the works that are considered modern is the new. What is the distinguished mark of what is considered as modernity? Something new, the new. So the recent modernity or our modernity breaks the spell of the classical, and is an ideal of infinite progress of human knowledge and infinite social and moral progress. Because of this infinite progress, our modernity, the recent modernity, is not going to point back to some early historic period. It is going to be forward looking. So our modernity is going to be forward looking, forward directed. our concept of modernism is opposed to the romantic conception of the Middle Ages. The romantic conception produced a radicalized consciousness of modernity that is detached from all the prehistorical connections and understood itself solely in abstract opposition to tradition and history as a whole. There is no connection between our modernity and some classical period. So the diverse of modernity from the ancient or the past. Habermas would state that this is reflected in the modern art, which relies solely on the present relevance, relies on the present, but he distinguishes it from fashion. Now, fashion is a restless movement from one thing to another. Modernity is not fashion. Modernity, what is merely stylish will be outdated, but that which is modern will preserve a secret tie to the classical. Now, what is a classic? Whatever can survive time is considered as classic. Thus, there is a power of being a classic. So, modernity has a tie to the classic, whatever can survive time. Modernity creates its own internal classical tradition. It sets its own internal standards of evaluation. It does not point itself to the past. It carries its standard of judgment inside itself and develops them within itself. The modern work has become a classic because it has been authentically modern. Thus, the relation between the modern and classical has lost a fixed historical relevance. The essay of Habermas is divided into the following parts. The first part is the discipline of aesthetic modernity. The second part is cultural modernity and societal modernization. The third part is called the project of enlightenment. The fourth part is the false programs of the negation of culture. And the last part, the fifth part, is alternatives. Now we shall have a short discussion of all these 5 parts of the essay. So the first part, the discipline of aesthetic modernity. Now, aesthetic modernism has its root in Baudelaire. Now, modernity developed through various avant-garde movements and reached its climax in Dadaism and Surrealism. Avant-garde art reflects a changed or transformed consciousness of time. Now, Habermas talks about the spatial metaphors of time, wherein we are moving into the future, conquering new territories of future, and the future is indefinite and contingent. It does not have any endpoint. The future does not have any endpoint. Avant-garde is concerned with the glorification of the present. It is associated with the generation of new and subjectively defined past. So, in this first part, Habermas talks about the avant-garde art, and avant-garde art is concerned with the glorification of the present. It is ahistorical and it attacks tradition as a given norm. The historical memory is replaced with the affinity to the present. So, the glorification of the present is seen in the avant-garde art. There is a tendency to blow up the continuum of history, to remove the continuum of history. Modernity revolts against the normalizing function of tradition. Modernity rebels against all that is normative. Now, this characteristic of the avant-garde art does not resonate much with people today. It used to draw people to it, but today it does not draw people to it, not anymore. Doesn't mean that the modernism is ending. The modern is ending. Habermas does not think so. He thinks that something has gone drastically wrong. Habermas then talks about the NeoConservatism, and he picks on Daniel Bell. Now, Bell talks about the crisis of the Western society due to the split between culture and society. The modernist culture has infected the values of the society. The dominant values today are the principles of unlimited self-realization, demand for authentic self-experience, subjectivism, and hyper-stimulated sensitivity, etc. Now, this lets out hedonistic motives and is against the discipline of a professional life in the society. Now all these are due to modernism. Now this modernist culture is incompatible with the traditional convictions, traditional values, traditional virtues of everyday life. And according to neoconservatism, what can restore ethics of discipline is religious revival. Religious faith tied to a faith and tradition will provide individuals with clearly defined identities and existential security. That is the first part. The second part, cultural modernity and societal modernization. Habermas believes that there is an intellectual and political confrontation with the carriers of cultural modernism in Germany and even in other states. Neoconservatism displaces blame for unwelcome consequences of capitalism onto cultural modernity. The unwelcome consequences are caused due to cultural modernity. The negative attitudes to work, consumer habits and the tendency to emphasize leisure time, etc. are negatives of the current generation, and these are ascribed as outcome of modernity. Thus the cultural critics are blaming the trends disproportionately for social and economic changes and deflecting the criticism from social economic causes. So according to Habermas, all these are caused because of social economic causes, but it is diverted and modernity is accused of all this. Habermas also talks about neo-populist protests. Now people who are gathering up the crowds for channeling their anger. He would say that neo-populist protests are giving expression to widespread fears concerning the possible destruction of the abundant and natural environment and the destruction of the humane from social life. Destruction of the humane from social life. Now these protests are arising out of fear, but these protests are being channeled in such a manner that they are not going to be productive about the causes of the fear, and these protests are in fact hurting only our possible source of resources, and that can solve some of these problems. So all these neo-populist protests are also attacking or targeting their anger towards modernism. But according to Habermas, culture is intervening in the creation of all these problems only in a very indirect and mediated manner. The accusation of the neoconservatism that social problems results from cultural modernity shows their analytical weakness. It arises from their weakness of analysis. Habermas states that the criticism raised by the neoconservatism is not due to the discontent about the antinomian consequences of culture, but it is a reaction against societal modernization. The societal modernization is penetrating deeper and deeper into the society. Thus the argument of neoconservatism is countered by stating it as a feeble argument, not very strong argument. The third part, it is titled as the project of enlightenment. What does he say in this particular part? Habermas then talks about the project of enlightenment or the project of modernity. He would say that modern society is characterized by differentiation, and this differentiation separates out things that were blended together in non-modern societies. It separates out science, morality, law, artistic production and critical practices. Everything used to be one united whole. Everything is separated out now. This differentiation will help each of these spheres to be institutionalized into its own realm, where it can develop its own internal logic. Now this will lead to progress in each field. But what actually happened was the one-sided development of science distorted into the development of technologies guided by capitalism, and the result of this distortion is evident in each field, in the increase of gap between the expert and the general public cultures. Habermas states that the Enlightenment era was optimistic that these specialized insights of the experts could spread into the popular realm. So the expertise gained by the expert people will be spread into the popular realm, general public. The general public will participate in the progress The general public will assimilate and incorporate and in the insights of many of these spheres, etc. But from where we stand today, Habermas says that things look quite pessimistic. It looks quite difficult to get the insights from the expert cultures to the general cultures, such that the experts are kept in check and they are influenced by the values of the general culture, and the general culture understands what is going on in the expert culture and can contribute to it meaningfully. The gap between the expert culture and the general culture remains. What has been gained, the expert knowledge that has been gained by the expert has not been transferred into the general public culture. The fourth part of the essay is the false programs of the negation of culture. When we examine the history of modern art, we find a tendency towards greater autonomy in the definition and practice of art, greater autonomy. The category of beauty and beautiful objects were constituted during the Renaissance. In the 18th century, arts, literature and music were institutionalized as independent from sacred and the courtly life. In the middle of the 19th century, we witnessed the rise of aestheticism with the slogan "art for art's sake." So the autonomy of aesthetics, autonomy of art. This shows the autonomy of the aesthetic sphere. In the words of Habermas, the media of expression and the techniques of production themselves became the aesthetic object. So the autonomy of aesthetics. By the modern times, art had completely dissociated from life. Art withdrew into the untouchableness of complete autonomy. But the surrealists have attempted a reconciliation between art and life, a reconciliation between fiction and praxis. But Habermas considers these attempts to reconcile art and life as nonsense experiments. All these attempts have tried to negate art. These efforts have not succeeded but have reiterated the autonomy of the art. So this attempt to bring together art and life, he would say it as unsuccessful experiments. Now these attempts, though have brought art closer to life, but unfortunately have strengthened the structures which the art is required to dissolve. If art wishes to complete the modernity project, it must refrain from increasingly extravagant attempts. If art wishes to complete the modernity project, it must refrain from all these attempts. For Habermas, the modernity project remains unfulfilled because art wrongly assumed its existence. Habermas sees this false negation of culture as a failure and says that there have been similar attempts in the spheres of theoretical and knowledge and morality. There have been talk about the negation of philosophy from the time of young Hegelians. The relationship of theory and practice has been posed since the time of Karl Marx. Now this was the negation of philosophy as well. So now Habermas would state that art is interested in disinterested pleasure. In contemplating art, there is no practical purpose at all. We used to think of art as having a practical purpose in our societies. Even if there is no practical use of aesthetic art, it has its own realm. Art has its own realm. Art can be evaluated not based on its usefulness, but it has its own realm of evaluation and criticism. Now we live in a broken society, and art helps us to have a confrontation with our brokenness. So the autonomy of aesthetics and the project of enlightenment. The next part of the essay, he talks about the alternatives. What are the alternatives? Habermas agrees that modernity has failed. However, he refuses to abandon this modernity as a project. Rather, he insists on learning from the mistakes of these extravagant programs which tried to negate modernity. Habermas says that alternatives do exist. He cites the example of bourgeois art that has two expectations from his audience. The bourgeois art that he has got two expectations from the audience. What is the first expectation of the bourgeois art? The ordinary man who enjoyed the art should educate himself to become an expert in the art. That is the first expectation. The second expectation of bourgeois art is that he should be able to use the art to relate to the problems of his life. So according to Habermas, the artistic production should be able to treat autonomous problems as well as the problems of general public. The exclusive concentration on aesthetics and the exclusion of the aspects of truth and justice will turn out to be a failure. Now Habermas mentions Albert Welmer, who suggests an aesthetic experience that is not framed around the expert's judgment of taste. The aesthetic experience should be used to enlighten the life historical problems. It should be related to the life problems. Thus, the aesthetic experience will renew the interpretation of our needs in whose light we perceive the world. Now, Habermas also mentions the German-Swedish writer Peter Weiss, who talks about the manner of receiving and relating to art. So, the German-Swedish writer Peter Weiss. He describes the process of reappropriating art by presenting the examples of a group of politically motivated, knowledge-hungry workers in Berlin in 1937. Now, these people, these workers, they had knowledge of general and social history of the European art. The knowledge that they had gathered, they reassembled in their own context, in their own social milieu. By this reappropriation, they were able to illumine the European art as well as their own social milieu. So, by reappropriation of art, they were able to illumine the European art as well as their own social milieu. Therefore, what Habermas is suggesting is the reappropriation of the expert's culture from the standpoint of the real world. Reappropriation of the expert's culture from the standpoint of the real world. Expert cultures can be appropriated from the perspectives of the life world. Thus, the project of modernity has not been fulfilled. Now, Habermas aims to relink the modern culture with everyday practice. This linking can be established only if the societal modernization can be steered in another direction. This is possible only if modernization can be developed in non-capitalist directions. We have to eliminate the domination of life from the capitalist economy and the bureaucratic state. In the last part of the essay, Habermas will talk about three types of conservatives. The first one he terms as young conservatives. The young conservatives want to break out of the modern world altogether. They have a modernist attitude towards modernism. Want to break away from modernism altogether. They do not want to break away from modernity and focus on something of the past, but they are looking at things outside modernity for new forms of spontaneity. They don't believe that we can do something more critical, more emancipatory with modernity. One has to burst outside its boundaries. So break away from modernity. Young conservatives. And there are the old conservatives. Who are they? These old conservatives, they do not allow themselves to be contaminated by cultural modernity in the first place. They don't want the modern world. They want to go back to an undifferentiated simple society prior to the modern technology. So they want to go back to the old times. There are the third type of conservatives known as the NeoConservatives. Who are they? Now these welcome science, even tolerate science to go outside its spheres and academic truths, particularly if these discussions are making contributions to the technology that is useful for capitalism. Now these are pro-science conservatives. NeoConservatives are pro-science conservatives. They seek to minimize the explosive potentials in cultural modernity. Thus, in summary, we can say that the German social theorist Jurgen Habermas is a strong defender of modernity. The assaults made by postmodernists on modernists are strongly countered by Habermas. Habermas sees structures of rationality in the institutional orders of modernity and insists on the potential of modernity. He has faith in the enlightenment project of a good society promoted by reason. He sees modernity as an unfinished project, and much more has to be done in the realm of modernity before thinking about the possibility of a postmodern world. Now he is aware of the distortions and pathologies of modernity, but he believes that they can be addressed and they can be resolved in a truthful way by protecting and expanding the sphere of communication rationality and by relinking the differentiated realms of science, morality and art. Habermas is arguing to retain commitment to modernity, and he discusses some of the principal themes of modernity in the context of a critical engagement with contemporary neoconservative cultural and political trends. He proposes the theory of communication and the theory of system and life world. Undistorted communication, he would say, leads to emancipation, and distorted communication will lead to false consciousness. Now, rationalization has primary role in undistorted communication. Habermas would reiterate the importance of capitalism for the economic progress, but he blames capitalism of its negative effects in society as well. He proposes the revival of the public sphere to establish control over economic processes. In his theory of rationalization of system and life world, system is the institutions of public sphere and life world is the day-to-day working, the public sphere and the day-to-day life. There should be rationality both in the system and in the life world. Now this will lead to a society with material abundance and control over its environment. But what has happened is the subordination of the life world by the system rationality. Subordination of the life world by the system rationality. Now life world has become subordinated to system rationality, and he would say that is not modernity. There should be an interlinking of the system rationality and the life world rationality. So my dear students, you have listened to a long discussion on the essay by Jurgen Habermas. Please prepare a summary of about 400 words of this particular essay, and it will help you to prepare for the examination. Thank you for your patient listening. Please stay safe at home. Have a nice time. Thank you.